Hercule Poirot and the Inkless Notebook. Chapter 1. The Silent Notebook. The coastal wind blew with a deceptive gentleness that autumn morning, carrying with it the scent of salt, wisteria, and mystery. High on the cliff, the estate known as Villa Asterion rested with a disturbing stillness, as if holding its breath before an impending tragedy. Its owner, the widow Isidora Vernet, had invited a small group of people to spend the weekend there. No one suspected that an unusual death would turn that social retreat into a crime scene. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the maid Odette discovered the lifeless body of Monsieur Armand des Fleurs, a renowned literary editor, in the villa's library. He was sitting in a green leather armchair, the lamp still lit on his shoulder. He seemed asleep, except for the stiffness of his neck and the open notebook on his knees, completely blank. The curious thing wasn't that the notebook was empty, but that, according to those present, Mr. de Fleur never left it alone. He used it as a personal diary, for professional notes, and even to draft letters he never sent. But that notebook had no ink. Not a stroke, not a word, just perfectly white pages. The local police, although efficient in matters of smuggling and inheritance disputes, were baffled by what appeared to be a death without a visible cause. There were no signs of violence, no apparent poison, no trace of a struggle. The country doctor pronounced cardiac arrest, but Mrs. Vernet, firm and pale, demanded a second opinion. And so it was that, the following morning, the man whose presence was enough to disturb the most deeply buried secrets arrived at Villa Asterion. The famous Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot. Dressed in his usual elegant attire, a light wool jacket, a perfectly knotted tie, and a pearl lapel pin, Poirot stepped out of the car with his characteristically meticulous gait. He greeted Madame Vernet with a slight bow. "Madam, I beg your pardon if I am too early for those who enjoy sleeping in. But crime, like breakfast, should be served while it is still hot." Isidora Vernet gave a tired smile. Her grey eyes were red, not from crying, but from tension. "I appreciate you coming so quickly, Monsieur Poirot. I don't trust hasty diagnoses. Armand didn't die by accident. He was restless, paranoid. He told me so Friday evening." Poirot narrowed his eyes, scanning the surroundings with curiosity. "Paranoid, you say? What exactly did you suspect?" "He didn't tell me. He just mentioned that there was something in that notebook. Something he had to decide whether to reveal or not." Poirot nodded slowly and took a small comb from his pocket to smooth his moustache, as if ordering his thoughts in the same way. "And that's the famous notebook, the one they found with him." "Yes, but it was empty." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, no, madame. He wasn't. He only seemed to be. That's very different." Madame Vernet frowned. Poirot continued. "Can I see the place where the body was found?" Madame Vernet led Poirot to the library, a circular room with ceiling-high oak bookshelves and a breathtaking view of the sea. The armchair was still there, surrounded by the carefully preserved scene. The notebook rested on a small table, protected by a plastic cover. Poirot opened it gently. The pages were white, perfect. No fingerprints, no ink, no visible pressure. "Curious," he murmured. "Who had access to this room between 9 at night and 7 in the morning?" "5 people, besides Armand and me," Madame Vernet replied. They were invited, my nephew Julien Vernet, his fiancée Colette Durand, Monsieur Léon Ferraud, Dr. Mirel, and Mademoiselle Chauvet, a former student of Armand's. Poirot nodded slowly. And everyone is still here? Yes, no one has left. Poirot turned to the window. The sun was already rising over the Atlantic, its golden reflection touching the surface like a secret yet to be told. Perfect. Then, madame, it's time for the little grey cells to begin their work. I'd like to speak to each of them, one by one. But first, would you allow me to see the quill Monsieur Desfleurs used to write with? Isidora nodded. It was always in his inside pocket, but when they found him, it wasn't there. Poirot smiled softly. Ah, voilà! The inkless notebook, the missing pen, and a man who lived between the lines. Don't you think, madam, that we now have enough ink to begin writing this story? And with that, Poirot closed the blank notebook with great care, as if he had already discovered a hidden truth within those empty pages. Chapter 2. 5 Shadows on White Paper. Poirot requested that the interviews be conducted in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed structure at the end of the garden, overlooking the sea and away from the hustle and bustle of the house. It was, in his words, a neutral place, neither too intimate nor too cold, ideal for the truth to flourish. The first to show up was Estelle Chauvet, a thin young woman with an angular face and large melancholic eyes. She wore a simple grey coat and held a book like a talisman. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly, I can't believe Armand is dead. He was my mentor for years. He taught me to write, to think. He encouraged me when no one else would. Poirot nodded, watching her closely. And did you visit him frequently, mademoiselle? We wrote to each other more than we saw each other. But yes, he came to the villa from time to time. This weekend, I don't know. I felt like something was different. I was distracted, even nervous. Did he tell you why? No, but he was talking to himself. One night I heard him say from the hallway, "If I write this down, I won't be able to ignore it any more." That scared me. Did you see the notebook? Of course, he always carried it. He called it the receptacle of his uncomfortable truths. He liked those phrases. Poirot smiled briefly. Thank you, mademoiselle. That will be all for now. When Estelle left, the Dr. Mirel, a short man with a round face and a deep voice, his unkempt moustache gave him the appearance of someone more accustomed to scalpels than to conversation. Did you certify Mr. Desfleurs' death? Yes. There were no external signs of trauma, no foam, no cyanosis. I assumed a sudden heart attack. Did you find anything strange? The doctor shrugged. Just that. Her pupils were dilated. That could indicate many things: fear, drugs, suffocation. But without further analysis. Did Mr. Desfleurs take medication? Not that I know of, but he wasn't my regular patient either. I only saw him here when we were together. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And where were you last night? In my room, writing letters. Breakfast confirms it. I was the first downstairs. And yes, the library door was closed. Odette opened it later. Poirot jotted something down in his notebook. Not in a vacuum, he thought ironically. The next one was Léon Ferraud, an elegant man of about 40, with a sharp eye and polished manner. He was a literary agent and, as Poirot discovered, had had dealings with Desfleurs. Satisfactory business, Monsieur Ferraud. It depended on the day. Armand was a genius with his authors, but he could also be ruthless. Recently, we argued over a manuscript I wanted to publish, and he wanted to withhold. He said there was something too compromising about it. Compromising for whom? He didn't say that, but he hinted that if that text were published, it would change several lives. That's why I was surprised when he agreed to come this weekend. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Do you think he felt threatened? More like he was calculating, as if he wanted to observe our reactions before deciding. And the notebook. He never let anyone read it. I tried once, years ago, and he almost kicked me out of his office. Poirot saw him off with a polite smile, and shortly afterwards received the Mr. Julien Vernet. Jovial, charismatic, but with a look that didn't quite match his smile. There was something about him, something restrained. Armand and I didn't get along badly, Monsieur Poirot, but we weren't close either. He was a difficult man. And your fiancée, Miss Durand? Julien hesitated. She valued his opinion. She sent him her poems. Armand was brutal in his criticism, but sometimes enthusiastic too. And how did you feel about it? Are you implying that he was jealous? Was he? Julian stared at him. No, I wasn't afraid of his influence, but I was worried about how much Colette depended on his approval. The last one to enter was Colette Durand. He was about 30 years old, with dark hair neatly tied back and an ambiguous expression, as if every word he said concealed an ulterior motive. Monsieur Desfleurs was a brilliant man, but he was also cruel. His opinion could elevate you or destroy you. And what did he do to you? Colette raised her chin. Both. He rejected 3 of my manuscripts. The 4th, he accepted it, but asked me not to share it yet. Too much truth for so little ink, he said. Did you know he left me a letter? Poirot raised his eyebrows. A letter? Yes, it's in my bag, but it's unsigned. Just 1 sentence. Some silences speak louder than 100 confessions. Poirot watched her silently, then bowed slightly. Thank you, mademoiselle. That's a revealing detail. When everyone had left, Poirot remained alone in the greenhouse for a few minutes, in absolute silence. The sea lapped gently against the rocks. He took out his notebook and wrote with his perfectly charged quill 5 suspects, 5 silences, an empty notebook that says more than it seems. And then he underlined a single word. Absence. Chapter 3. The Truths That Are Not Written. After the interviews, Poirot returned to the library, accompanied only by Odette, the maid. With a precise step, he walked to Armand Desfleurs' desk. He ran his fingertips over the surface without touching anything directly. His gaze lingered on the small details. A faint circular indentation on the leather where a glass had rested. A slight fold in the carpet just beside the armchair. A rectangular hollow above the mantelpiece that seemed to have contained a recently removed object. Mademoiselle Odette, said Poirot in a kind but firm voice, you were the one who discovered the body. Did you notice anything in the room that seemed out of place? The young woman nodded nervously. Monsieur, I serve breakfast at 7. As always, I went to open the curtains. I saw him there, as if he were asleep. But there was a sheet of paper on the floor, white, like from a notebook. I thought it was trash, and threw it away before the lady arrived. Did he play anything else? No, sir, he swore. Poirot didn't reprimand her. He just nodded slowly. Do you remember if the notebook was open or closed? Open, on his knees, but every page was clean. Poirot asked her to tell him exactly where the leaf fell. She indicated a spot near the window. He bent down, took out his pocket magnifying glass, and examined the carpet. Barely perceptible, a soft pressure line revealed the outline of what had undoubtedly been a folded leaf. Touching it with gloves, he noticed something even more curious, a faint trace of what looked like dampness, not water, tears perhaps. On his way out, Poirot found the local Inspector Girard in the hall. He was a burly man with a permanent frown. "Any progress, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked somewhat sceptically. Poirot shrugged elegantly. "My friend, in crimes where there is no blood, logic is the only one that leaves traces." Girard snorted, but did not reply. Poirot continued, "I need to check the guest rooms, discreetly, and also, Monsieur l'Inspecteur, I'd like to know who had access to de Fleur's office in Paris during the last week." "Paris?" "Yes, according to Mrs. Vernet, Armand travelled there 4 days ago. He said he was going to pick up something important. What did he bring? No one knows, but it's not among his belongings here, nor in the safe. And you think that has to do with—" "Everything, sir. The empty notebook. Perhaps it isn't empty at all. Or perhaps what it said was extracted before the police arrived." As Girard left, Poirot received a sealed envelope from Madame Vernet. Inside was a letter in Armand's own handwriting, dated the day before his death. "Isadora, if anything happens to me, don't let them destroy this notebook. Inside, it contains my final judgment. It's not a legal testament, but a moral one. The ink may fail, but the intention never does." Poirot read it several times. Then he took out his own pen and wrote in his notebook, "The trial without ink. Who was condemned, and why?" Evening fell on Villa Asterion, tinting the walls a melancholic amber hue. Poirot, alone in the drawing-room, was thinking, why would a man like de Fleur, precise, vain, meticulous in his record of the world, remain silent just when he seemed poised to reveal something crucial? At that moment, Julien Vernet entered with a gesture of urgency. "Monsieur Poirot, you must see this." He handed him a red-covered diary. Opening it, Poirot found a series of names with dates next to them. Some were crossed out, others were underlined. One of them, at the bottom of the list, was circled, E. Chauvet, 1110. "I found it in his desk drawer, hidden under a false bottom," Julien explained. "Thank you, sir. Did anyone else see this list?" "I don't think so. I've kept it a secret myself since I discovered it." Poirot looked at the name circled in the centre, Estelle Chauvet. The date, the day after his arrival at the villa. "And is it today, October 12th? Poirot closed the agenda. "So, Monsieur Vernet, I believe that Mademoiselle Chauvet has just climbed several steps on the ladder of interest in this case." But Poirot didn't move. He stood there, holding the diary as if it contained a bomb about to explode, because at the bottom edge of the page, in almost illegible handwriting, was written, "Do not forget, silence also writes." Chapter 4. The Echo of the Absent Inks. The next morning dawned in a thick mist, as if the sky had decided to envelop Villa Asterion in a veil of uncertainty. Poirot, as usual, had gotten up early. He drank his coffee with a single spoonful of sugar and checked for the third time the red diary that Julien Vernet had given him the night before. Estelle Chauvet's name, circled with the exact date of her arrival at the villa, pulsed in the centre of the page like a warning beacon. At 9 o'clock, Poirot asked to see the young woman again. This time, the meeting took place in the yellow drawing-room, where the soft echo of the antique clocks made the silences even more meaningful. Estelle came in with a somewhat uneasy expression. "Do you wish to see me again, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, mademoiselle. I found a list on Mr. de Fleur's property. Your name appears there with a specific date. Can you explain that to me?" Estelle tensed. "My name? Where?" Poirot showed her the diary. The young woman paled. She sat down without being asked. That date is the day I came. Armand asked me to come. He said he had something important to tell me. But he never did. And didn't you find it strange that he wrote it down so precisely? Maybe he was planning to reveal something to me. Or maybe he expected something from me. Poirot crossed his legs slowly without taking his eyes off her. "What kind of relationship did you have with Monsieur de Fleur?" Estelle hesitated. Then, after a long sigh, she confessed. "I admired him deeply. For years he was my tutor, my guide. But 6 months ago, he stopped answering my letters. I felt rejected, displaced. I came here because he wrote to me 2 weeks ago, saying he wanted to make up for his silence." Poirot took note. Then he bowed his head slightly. "Do you think the contents of the notebook had something to do with you? I don't know. But I was afraid so, because," she looked down, "because years ago I gave him something. A manuscript, a novel based on true events. Very true. Armand told me it should never be published. That truth without context is a dangerous weapon." Poirot looked at her closely. And what was that manuscript about? About something that happened in his youth. A scandal that almost no one knew about. He told me about it one night, drunk. I made it into fiction, but he admitted it. And you think anyone else knew? No. But he wrote it down in his notebook, and someone read it. There would be motive, Poirot concluded. Motive enough to kill him and make the evidence disappear. She nodded silently, her face pale as a page from a book that had never been written. Later, Poirot went up to the deceased's office. He had searched it briefly before, but now he inspected the drawers and secret compartments more closely. Under Tirzou, a correspondence folder, he found a letter without an envelope, crumpled and written in obvious haste. The ink had run in one corner, as if the author had hesitated or wept while writing it. "Julian, I've made mistakes, I know, but there's a line that mustn't be crossed. Literature should reflect the truth, not protect it. I've decided. I'll talk. A.D." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Would Julien Vernet, his charming nephew, have anything to lose in a public revelation. In the middle of the morning, Poirot requested a conversation with Julien, who arrived with the confident gait of someone who is not afraid of being questioned. "Monsieur Poirot," he said lightly, "to what do I owe the honour?" "You told me you had no serious conflicts with Mr. de Fleur. Can I show you something?" He took out the letter. Julien read it, frowning slightly. "I didn't know that. It seems to be addressed to you. Maybe so, although I don't recognize that handwriting for sure. And it's unsigned." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "It's not the content that interests me now, monsieur, but the implicit threat. I'll talk. What could de Fleur possibly talk about that would affect you?" Julien crossed his arms. "My uncle was a man who enjoyed manipulating. He did it even with kind words. If he was planning a revelation, maybe it wasn't about me. Maybe it was about someone else, and he only used my name to pressure me." "And who would you want to pressure?" Julien didn't reply. Poirot didn't press the issue. He simply watched the young man leave the room, his jaw set. Shortly afterwards, Colette Durand sought out Poirot on her own initiative. She seemed upset. "Sir, I think you should know this. Last night I found a loose leaf in my poetry book. It wasn't there before." "And what did he say?" Colette pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. It was handwritten, unsigned. "Ink isn't visible to the naked eye. Look for the pressure, not the colour." Poirot read it and smiled with a mixture of approval and expectation. Ah, finally, the killer makes a mistake. Or maybe he leaves a clue. He asked to see de Fleur's original notebook once more. This time, he held it under an oblique lamp, slowly turning it. And there, like a whisper against the silence, appeared what had not been seen before. A series of lines printed by the pressure of writing, though, without ink. Entire sentences, as if engraved in the air. "Ah, my friends," Poirot murmured to himself. It wasn't an inkless notebook. It was a notebook in which something had been written, intended to be read only by those who knew how to look. Chapter 4. The invisible writing. Poirot placed the notebook carefully on the table in the yellow drawing-room, holding the lamp back just enough so that the grazing light revealed the traces of the letters. The barely perceptible marks formed lines of careful, structured handwriting, as if written with deliberate intent, but without ink. "A message without ink," he murmured. The killer didn't destroy the words. He simply hoped no one would be able to read them. He used a sheet of onion skin paper and a graphite pencil to trace the grooves. Meticulously, he copied the words. The first sentences were cryptic, almost poetic. "Sometimes the truth is most dangerous when it's not yet born, but it's already moving. It's already breathing. This story must be told, even if I don't finish it." Poirot continued tracing. The next paragraph was clearer, and the tone changed. "Estelle brought me the story, but the story isn't hers. She was the bearer, not the author. Someone else lived that truth, someone who swore never to speak." Poirot stopped. He frowned. That line, "The story isn't yours," shattered a previous assumption. Was Estelle merely a medium, not a confidant? The next segment seemed to reveal a name, but the pressure of the letters was weaker. Only a few letters stood out. O-L-E-U. Poirot repositioned the sheet. He carefully completed the tracing. Finally, the sentence appeared. Colette was the voice, but not the pen. And Julian? Julian protected more than he'll ever admit. Poirot took a step back, his brow furrowed, his head tilted slightly. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place on the table. Shortly afterward, he asked Odette to gather Colette Durand in the music room. There, amid the soft echoes of a silent piano, he questioned her without apparent pressure, but with surgical precision. Mademoiselle Durand, in your previous testimony, you mentioned having received severe criticism from Monsieur Desfleurs, but you also mentioned a manuscript he approved. May I ask you a direct question? Sure, she replied, with the tense composure of someone expecting an attack. Was that manuscript yours? Colette blinked, and for the first time her facade cracked. Why, do you ask? Because Armand wrote that you were the voice, but not the pen. That is, you gave life to other people's words. Whose were they? The silence that followed was revealing. Colette looked away, but then, almost in a whisper, I can't say. Why does the story involve someone present in this village? She swallowed. She lowered her voice. It's an old story, a betrayal, a confession that was given to me as a secret, and that I transformed into fiction. Estelle read it first, then Armand. They both recognized something in it that shouldn't be revealed. But I couldn't stop myself from writing it down. And the manuscript, it's in my room. But I hid it after Armand died. I was afraid someone would find it and think I had motives. Reasons like what? As revenge or blackmail? But I just wanted to write. Is that a crime? Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked for the manuscript. Colette brought it. A bundle of hand-bound sheets, untitled, unsigned, back. In his room, Poirot read the text with increasing attention. It was a story set in the 1970s at a French university. A young woman was emotionally exploited by a married professor, humiliated, and eventually expelled for fabricated reasons. Years later, that same professor rose to become a prestigious literary editor, and protected his reputation by destroying evidence that could incriminate him. The narrative was ambiguous. It never directly named the culprit. But there were overly specific details, places and dates that matched, and at the heart of it all, a confession written from a third-person perspective. I saw, I knew, and I kept quiet. Poirot closed the manuscript. He took out his personal notebook and wrote, The voice was Colette's, the story was Estelle's, but the silence belonged to Julien. Hours later, in the study, Poirot checked the missing objects from Desfleurs' office. The quill pen hadn't been found, nor had a small case of personal letters. But now, after reading the manuscript, the reason behind these absences began to become clear. The manuscript, the Inkless entries, the red diary, everything pointed to a deliberate attempt to reveal something that had remained hidden for decades. Poirot walked to the window where the fog was beginning to dissipate, revealing the sea with renewed clarity. The killer, he said softly, didn't kill out of impulse, but out of control. Not out of hatred, but out of fear. And that fear he hasn't finished speaking yet. Chapter 6. The Man Who Kept Too Silent. That afternoon, while the rest of the guests tried to keep up appearances with a forced lunch on the terrace, Poirot remained in the deceased's office. Surrounded by the shadows of imposing bookshelves and the soft creaking of the parquet floor, the Belgian detective meditated. Everything revolved like a silent dance around three people, Estelle, Colette, and Julien. Each had contributed a piece to the puzzle, but none of them had quite fit together. Yet, the manuscript, carefully disguised as fiction, revealed a story of abuse of power. The red diary indicated a plan, and the Inkless notebook, it was an unsigned confession, a bomb without a detonator. Why write without ink? Why leave clues instead of speaking out loud? Poirot tapped the surface of the table with his fingers in rhythmic order. He thought. At that moment, Inspector Girard burst in without knocking, panting slightly. "Monsieur, Poirot, we've just received the preliminary toxicology report from Paris. There's no trace of common poison. However, the report mentions an unusual compound, scopolamine. In precise doses, it causes muscle paralysis, inhibits willpower, and can simulate a heart attack if combined with prior anxiety." Poirot raised an eyebrow. And who in this house could have access to something like that? Girard lowered his voice. "Dr. Mirel. He has a small collection of rare compounds in his office, I'm told, and he works with geriatric patients, where these substances can be used in microdoses." Poirot narrowed his eyes. That piece hadn't appeared before. Too convenient, or a carefully hidden truth. Thank you, Inspector. But we shouldn't rush into anything yet. The truth, like crime, needs context. Shortly after, Poirot requested a second interview with Julien Vernet. This time, the conversation took place in the library, in front of the same armchair where Armand de Fleur had died. Julien entered with a worried expression. "Another talk, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes. There are details I need to understand better. You were his nephew. A family connection that not everyone knew about. Armand didn't talk about family. He had his reasons. And you." Julien took a deep breath. "I just wanted him to put everything in writing. He told me I shouldn't tarnish his legacy, but that legacy hid a lot of things. Were you afraid that de Fleur would speak?" Julien looked at him harshly. "What are you implying?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his tone imperturbable. "I'm implying that you knew what Armand was planning, to say that you found his notebook, and that maybe you wanted to protect something. Yourself. Someone else." Julien jumped up. "I don't have to listen to this. Au contraire, monsieur," Poirot replied calmly. "You have every reason to do so, because the truth has already been written. Not in ink, not in shouts, but it is here, in the shadows." Julien stood still. Poirot stood up too slowly. "I know you're not an impulsive killer. You didn't act out of hatred. You acted out of fear. Fear that the Vernet name, your family, your heritage, would be forever tarnished. And I suspect that manuscript contained a version of events that, if confirmed publicly, would destroy not only the memory of Armand, but the figure of another man as well. Who? Your father, perhaps, or someone you admired. Is that right?" Julien looked down. "I can't say. It's buried history. Dead people. What does it matter?" Poirot approached slowly. "It matters because Armand decided it was time to put it on record. But you decided not to. And that night, Monsieur Vernet, you entered this library, and something happened. Julian murmured, "I didn't kill him." Not deliberately, maybe, but scopolamine. Did you have it? No. And who then? Someone who acted on your behalf? Julian did not respond. Poirot changed his tone. Softer. Julien, you're not the only one who keeps quiet. Someone else in this house knows your fear, and uses it. There's a second will here, a more subtle mind. The young man seemed to hesitate. Are you saying there's another culprit? Poirot nodded. Oui. One who watched while others spoke, one who didn't write, but manipulated the words of others, who used buried truths to provoke fear, and then disappeared from the scene. Julien looked up, and then, with a tremble in his voice, "You're talking about Léon Ferreau?" Poirot didn't reply. He just looked at him, his expression calm, while he wrote a single sentence in his notebook. Ferreau didn't write the crime. He edited it. Chapter 7. The Editor of... Silence. That afternoon, the sun was barely breaking through the grey clouds, as if the sky itself was hesitant to reveal what it knew. Poirot, with his cane under his arm, walked slowly through the inner garden of Villa Asterion. It wasn't a leisurely stroll. It was, as he said, a choreography of thought. The crime story had a structure reminiscent of an unfinished manuscript, well-disguised chapters, an invisible narrator, and a deliberate editing of the climax. Who better to fine-tune a narrative than someone whose job was precisely that? Léon Ferreau, the literary agent, always elegant, always courteous. He had been surprisingly quiet since the first interviews. Too observant, too neutral. Poirot, discreetly, summoned him to the reading room, away from the others. Ferreau arrived punctually, with a book under his arm and a cautious smile. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as he sat down, "I'm intrigued that you wish to speak to me again." "Yes, Monsieur Ferreau. Crime, like literature, is not solved solely by what is said, but by what is left out." Ferreau smiled but said nothing. "I read the manuscript Colette was hiding, and I saw the notes pressed into Monsieur de Fleur's notebook. You knew that story. You've known it for a long time, I suspect." Ferreau raised his eyebrows elegantly. "Me? Why do you think so?" "Because the manuscript isn't new. It's a rewrite, a stylized version of a true story. And there are editorial corrections, changes in tone, subtle cuts, marks that aren't, typical of an amateur author." Ferreau narrowed his eyes. Poirot continued, "You helped polish that text. You knew it was dangerous, yes, but also valuable. And you wanted to control it. Armand wouldn't allow it. That's why you argued. That's why you tried to negotiate. But when you learned Armand was willing to include his truth in the notebook, you acted. How did I act exactly? As a good editor would. He didn't delete the words. He silenced them. He didn't destroy the content. He rendered it invisible. He replaced the pen with one without ink. He preserved the structure. But he altered the meaning." Ferreau leaned back in the armchair. "A fascinating theory. Do you have any proof?" Poirot bowed slightly. "I need nothing more than your own words, monsieur. You said de Fleur wanted to withhold a compromising manuscript, that he believed it would affect many lives. You knew too much, and you weren't willing to let the scandal get out. because it implicated someone you've protected for years." Poirot didn't reply. His expression became more severe, more controlled. "Who do you protect, Mr. Poirot?" The silence was so long that it seemed like an answer. To Julien, a slight movement of the eyebrows. Poirot nodded to himself. "He doesn't know you're protecting him. He thinks you're just acting out of self-interest. But you've been editing his life from the shadows, rejecting manuscripts that could damage him, controlling versions, leaking rumours. Armand was the only variable you couldn't control." Poirot sighed. He took out a handkerchief and cleaned his glasses. "Don't kill him, Poirot. Not with your own hands, no. But you had access to the scopolamine. You were the one who pressured Armand not to talk. And on the night of the crime, you were the one who changed the pen in the notebook. Not to kill, but to erase. The crime, Monsieur Poirot, was an addition." Poirot stood still, and Julien, innocent at the execution, but not in the past. He knew too. He also kept silent. A long moment passed between them. Finally, Poirot said, "I didn't want to destroy anyone, just protect what was left." "Sometimes, monsieur," said Poirot gently, "what is so carefully protected ends up rotting from within." That evening, Poirot summoned Madame Vernet. He handed her the manuscript, the carbon copybook, and a letter he had just written. This must be preserved, not to be published, but to be understood. Isidora Vernet, serene as always, nodded. "So it's all over." Poirot looked out the window, where the shadows were beginning to merge with the sea. "No, madam, but the truth, at least, has begun to speak." Chapter 8. The Editor's Footprints. At dawn the next day, Villa Asterion seemed to exude a tense calm, as if it knew the final pieces of the mystery were about to fall. Poirot, impeccably dressed, stood in the private dining room, leafing through Colette Durand's manuscript for the last time, not as a reader, but as an analyst. He looked for inconsistencies, repetitions, subtle edits that revealed the signature of someone who, while not writing, did manipulate the words. One passage particularly caught her attention. In it, the narrator mentioned a key scene, a private conversation between the young protagonist and the professor. The scene, although charged with emotional tension, omitted a crucial detail. There was no context about how they met, nor why the encounter occurred on that particular date. Poirot murmured, "Too clean, too controlled. Here's a professional editor, not just an inspired author." With the Inkless notebook now fully transcribed, the truth emerged like a footprint under the snow. The final sentence on the last page, written boldly but without ink, read, "If this story dies with me, someone will have defeated time. But if someone reads it, then time can no longer lie." It was a strange phrase, not a lament, a warning. Poirot went to find Estelle. The young woman was on the north veranda, looking out at the sea. She was holding an open letter, her face streaked with silent tears. "Are you all right, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. "I received this morning," he said, handing her the letter without speaking further. Poirot read it. It was from Armand des Fleurs, dated 3 days before his death. In it, the editor apologized. Not for what he had done, because I never knew if I hurt you or just exposed you to him, but for not having defended his story when he had the chance. The letter ended with an enigmatic line. "They know, but you were the only one who believed that silence wasn't justice." "This is important, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "Did you show it to anyone?" "No, I hid it. I didn't trust anyone. Until now." Poirot nodded to him. "You did well, but now it's time for you to rely on something else. Order. Truth, when presented logically, needs no emotional defense, only structure." Estelle looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "And what will happen now? Now, mademoiselle, we reveal the true architect of silence." That same afternoon, Poirot asked everyone present to assemble in the library. He sat down in the leather armchair, right where Armand had been found. The others sat around him. Isidore Vernet, Julien, Colette, Estelle, Dr. Mirel, Léon Ferraud, and Inspector Girard Poirot interlaced his fingers. "I've gathered enough pieces. Not physical evidence, that would be too simplistic, but facts aligned logically. A crime without visible violence. An empty notebook that wasn't empty. A manuscript that read like fiction. And 5 people who shared a secret, but only one who wanted to control it." He turned to Léon Ferraud. "You, monsieur, tried to suppress a truth. Not because you wanted to protect your name, but someone else's. You didn't kill Armand with your own hands, but you replaced the pen. You gave him one without ink. And that night, when Armand wanted to write for the last time, he couldn't leave a record with the force he desired." Ferraud said nothing. His face hardened. Poirot continued. "But that wasn't enough. I also needed to erase what I'd already written." And then another accomplice to silence intervened. Someone who took the notebook before it was discovered. Someone who tore out a page and destroyed it. Odette saw that page. It was on the floor. White. Or did it look white? Girard intervened. "The leaf that was thrown away." "Exactly," Poirot interrupted. "It was written with an invisible pen. Armand didn't want just anyone to read what he had to say, but he did leave a copy, pressed down firmly, and it's that copy we reconstructed." He turned to Julien. "Monsieur Vernet, you believed Léon was acting for your own good, but it was your silence that made everything easier. The fear that the manuscript story would reveal something deeper, the story of your father, of your family. Armand didn't want revenge. He wanted to free himself. But you withdrew even more." Julien lowered his head. Colette and Estelle exchanged a meaningful look. Dr. Mirel seemed uncomfortable. And Ferraud simply remained silent. He was the one who finally was saying too much. Poirot stood up. He walked slowly towards the door. "I've given the inspector the necessary documents. The prosecutor's office will decide whether the acts committed are punishable as homicide or obstruction. But I've already done my part. The truth has already been told, even if it's in ink that only a few can read." Chapter 9. The Lies That Remain. After the dramatic meeting in the library, the atmosphere at Villa Asterion became stifling. Although no one present had been immediately arrested, the weight of Poirot's moral accusation hung over everyone like a thick, persistent fog. Conversations became evasive, footsteps quieter, and glances more prolonged than decorum permitted. That evening, Poirot dined alone. He politely declined Madame Vernet's invitation to share the table. He had, he explained, an appointment with the memory of a man who wanted to speak, and who was allowed to write only without ink. As she stirred the sugar in her tea with almost symbolic slowness, she thought about the final chapter of the story. The crime had already been unmasked, yes, but what happened after the truth was told? Did the truth cleanse? Did it heal? Or did it simply wound and leave scars, where before there had been only silence? The next morning, Poirot again requested a private conversation with Estelle Chauvet, this time in the garden, under a pergola covered with withered wisteria. The young woman looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Mademoiselle Chauvet," he began gravely, "your story was used. Of that I have no doubt, but it was also silenced. And I wonder if, deep down, part of you preferred it that way." Estelle did not respond immediately. "When you've suffered in silence for a long time," he said finally, "the idea of screaming seems ridiculous, and then it's scary. The silence becomes a habit. But Colette, she upset the balance. She wrote everything down without asking permission. And that made her angry." Estelle looked out to sea. "I don't know. At first, yes. Then I realized he'd done it for me, that his fury was a mirror of the pain I didn't want to look at. But now, it doesn't matter anymore. The story is there. It no longer belongs to me alone." Poirot nodded understandingly. There's courage in writing, but even more courage in accepting to be read. Then he looked for Colette. He found her on the west side of the gallery, organizing her papers with trembling hands. When she saw him, she looked down. "Do you want to accuse me too, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, mademoiselle, I want to understand. Why did you decide to write that story?" "Why now? Because I couldn't keep it quiet any longer. Because I carried it inside me like a slow poison. And because Armand told me that if I really wanted to be a writer, I had to write something that hurt, something that burned me. I did it, and now I don't know if I've freed myself or condemned myself. Perhaps both, mademoiselle. Literature doesn't redeem, it only reveals." She sighed, exhausted. "What will happen to Ferraud? Justice will act. But perhaps the hardest part has already happened. He's lost his mask." Later, Poirot spoke to Julien, Vernet for the last time. He found him alone, smoking in front of the cliffs. The sea breeze stirred his coat, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. "I didn't know," Julien said without preamble, "that Ferraud was protecting me. I thought he was just trying to manipulate Armand. But it was all for me, for something I barely remembered." Poirot listened to him attentively. "Inherited sins are like long shadows, Monsieur Vernet. Not everyone notices them until the sun sets." Julien turned to him. "And what will I do now? I suggest you stop editing your story. Live it, and for once, write your own truth, in ink." That afternoon, as Poirot retired to his room to pack, he received a discreet note under his door. It was from Isidora Vernet. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not for solving a crime, but for leaving intact what could have been saved. Sometimes, in grand salons, justice needs to enter in slippers." Poirot smiled, folded the note, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Before leaving, she went down to the library one last time. Armand's armchair was still there, this time unoccupied. On the table, at Isadora's request, lay two objects: the restored notebook with all its markings visible, and Colette's manuscript, uncorrected. Just as it was written. Poirot leaned toward them both, and with his precise handwriting, he added a line to the first page of the notebook. Here silence ends. Here truth begins. Chapter 10. The last line. The day of departure arrived with a serene air that seemed oblivious to everything that had happened at Villa Asterion. The storm had passed, yes, but it had left behind bent trees, windows that no longer closed completely, and invisible cracks in the walls of human relationships. Poirot, impeccable as ever, supervised the preparation of his luggage, while looking from his window at the imposing profile of the sea, whose waves had been crashing with the same rhythm since the beginning of the case. Mid-morning, Inspector. Girard appeared with an expression somewhere between frustrated and resigned. "There will be no immediate arrest," he said in the dry tone of someone who no longer expects formal justice. The prosecutor considers the material evidence against Ferraud to be circumstantial. There are no witnesses. There are no fingerprints, only inferences. Poirot was not upset. Understandable. Legal justice demands evidence. Moral justice, on the other hand, is satisfied with clarity. Is that enough? Poirot closed his suitcase gently. When the crime isn't committed with blood, but with the soul, sometimes exposure is the deepest punishment. Believe me, Inspector, Léon Ferraud is no longer the man who arrived in this town. Girard didn't insist. He withdrew with a weary gesture, leaving Poirot in silence. Shortly after, the detective went to say goodbye to each of them personally. He found Estelle in the greenhouse, writing for the first time without trembling. Colette was in the library, finishing a dedication. Tutu. Those who couldn't speak, but still left their voice. Julien Vernet found himself in Armand's office, holding the red diary. When he saw Poirot, he handed it to him without a word. Poirot accepted it, saying only, "Don't repeat the mistake of trying to correct the past. Just make sure you don't perpetuate it." Finally, he headed out onto the terrace, where Isidora Vernet was waiting for him with tea and a new notebook, bound in black leather. "For you," he said, "no ink yet, but plenty of room for your own truths." Poirot smiled. He accepted it reverently. "Thank you, madame. I hope to fill it with logic, not regrets." He walked down the gravel path to the main entrance, where the chauffeur was already waiting. The black car gleamed in the pale sun. But just before going up, he stopped. There was something else. He took out of his jacket the tracing paper he had made from Desfleur's invisible notebook. He studied it once more. There was a line in the margin, so faint it had gone unnoticed. The real crime wasn't what they did to me, but what wasn't said when it could still be forgiven. Poirot remained motionless. That sentence struck him harder than any revelation in the case, because this wasn't about murder, or the substitution of a pen, or the manipulation of a story. It was about silence as a choice, as a weapon, as cowardice. Ah, my poor Desfleur, you weren't looking for revenge, but for redemption. But they wouldn't even allow you that. He got into the car and drove off. The villa remained behind, ever smaller in the rearview mirror. But the case of the Inkless notebook didn't fade away. It remained in Poirot's mind like a formless echo, a voiceless murmur. During the return journey, Poirot opened the new notebook Isidora had given him. He took his pen, and on the first page wrote in neat strokes, "It's not the ink that reveals the truth. It's the decision to write it." Then he closed his notebook, leaned his cane against his leg, and allowed himself, for the first time in days, to close his eyes. He had solved the crime, yes, but even more, he had given shape to the silence. Chapter 11. The Notebook That Doesn't Burn. A few days after his return to London, Poirot received an unexpected letter. The envelope, with no letterhead or return address, contained only a yellowed sheet of paper with a sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Neither ink nor silence destroys a story. Only fire does. L.F." Poirot raised an eyebrow. It was a provocation, or perhaps a confession. The postmark was from Bordeaux. Ferraud had left Villa Asterion before the prosecutor had finished deliberating. He didn't flee. He had no legal reason to do so, but he disappeared from the scene like a good editor when his presence was no longer welcome on the page. Poirot placed the letter on his desk, among clippings from previous cases, and leaned back in his reading chair. Everything in that case had revolved around what couldn't be seen. The blank page, the missing ink, the repressed memories. However, there were still loose ends, and one of them particularly worried him. What happened to the manuscript? It had been delivered to Madame Vernet, yes, and her copy was protected. But Colette Durand, according to the reports Poirot had discreetly requested the day after her departure, had disappeared from the Paris boarding-house where she lived. The owner only said that she left with a suitcase and a wooden box. Poirot switched on the desk lamp. He opened his notebook and reviewed his own words. The voice was Colette's. The story was Estelle's. The silence was Julian's. The editing was Ferraud's. But the flame, whose was it? The fire. An implicit threat. A warning from Ferraud. Was it possible the manuscript was in danger? Poirot wasn't a man to leave loose ends. He grabbed his coat and headed for the French embassy. An hour later, he had arranged, with the discretion that only a name like his could afford, for a sealed copy of the manuscript to be sent to a notary in Brussels. Not as a literary work, but as a testimony. "If one disappears, there will be another," he murmured, not out of ego, out of justice. That same night he received a call. "Monsieur Poirot," said a trembling voice on the other end. "It's Estelle Chauvet. Colette, she's gone." "Missing? Voluntarily?" "He left me a note. He says the manuscript is now mine, that he no longer wants to speak for others, that he needs to find his voice without lending it any more." Poirot took a deep breath. There was truth in that. Colette wasn't the victim, nor the culprit. She had been a bridge, and now she wanted to be destiny. "Mademoiselle Chauvet," he said gently, "perhaps it's your turn to write now, not to expound, but to close. Do you think I should publish it?" "Only if something changes, not in the reader." In you, Estelle didn't reply, but as he hung up, Poirot felt the conversation had been less of an ending and more of a continuation. The next day he received another letter, this time from the Brussels notary. Manuscript received. Instructions understood. Sealed copy in storage. Will only be opened if you disappear or at your express request. Poirot nodded, satisfied. The Inkless notebook wouldn't be burned, and the story so many wanted to suppress now existed, even if no one else ever read it. That evening, as he tidied his desk, Poirot took out the black leather notebook Isidora Vernet had given him. Still empty, still expectant. He took his pen and wrote, "Some cases are resolved in classrooms, others in libraries, but this one was resolved between margins, between unprinted spaces, in the ink that can't be seen, and in the story that no one wants to sign." Then he closed the notebook and put it away in the deepest drawer of his desk. And with that, finally, Hercule Poirot concluded the case of the Inkless notebook. Chapter 12. The Echo That Endures. Hercule Poirot's life once again returned to its orderly rhythm. Mornings filled with hot chocolate and Belgian newspapers. Afternoons of precise walks and geometric reflections. Nights of perfectly regulated silence. And yet, even amid the comforting symmetry of his routine, something about the Villa Asterion affair continued to throb at the margins of his mind. A month after the formal closure of the case, closure without arrests, without convictions, without scandal, Poirot was visited by an unexpected face, Julien Vernet. The young man appeared at the door of her London apartment, unannounced, without a suitcase, only a rain-soaked coat, and the expression of someone who had come to surrender. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as soon as he opened the door, "I need to speak, not to the detective, to the man." Poirot ushered him in without a word. He offered him a towel, then a coffee, and observed him with the discreet patience of someone who already knows what he's going to hear. Julien sat on the edge of the sofa, without looking at the detective. "I've read the manuscript. Estelle sent it to me. I'd never done that before. I only knew what was in it, but not how to say it." Poirot remained silent. It wasn't just my father's story, or Armand's. It was mine too, not because of fault, but because of omission. Because I refused to know more, to ask. I thought silence protected me, but it only made me ignorant. Poirot nodded slightly. "Ignorance is also a decision, Monsieur Vernet." "Ferraud didn't do it alone," Julien continued. "I knew Armand was writing something. I knew about the notebook. I knew about the change of pen. I didn't force him to do it, but I didn't stop him. I saw him tremble that night, and I did nothing." Poirot leaned towards him. "And now, why have you come?" Julien took a folded sheet of paper out of his coat. "Because this was also part of the story." Poirot unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, a very short one. "Julien, if one day you understand what I've kept quiet, maybe you won't hate me. Silence never made me a coward. It made me an accomplice. A. Armand Desfleurs. One last note, brief, definitive. I found it among his books. It wasn't hidden. I just hadn't dared to look." Poirot refolded the paper and handed it back. To him. "So now you have a choice. You can't change what was written, but you can decide what is written next." Julian looked into his eyes for the first time. What if I can't do it? It will be. Maybe not as a writer, but as a witness. Julian simply left. Poirot watched him from the window until he disappeared into the rain. Then he returned to his desk and took out the black notebook, which he still hadn't finished, wrote, "The story that no one wanted to sign ended up being signed by everyone. There is no crime without a cause, nor cause without consequence. But in this case, the punishment was memory, and that, monsieur, never expires." That same night, he received a letter from Estelle. It read, "I've decided to publish it, under a pseudonym, not out of fear, but out of respect. I won't sign what wasn't completely mine. But I won't let it be lost either. Thank you for teaching me that some truths don't seek justice, only existence." Monsieur Poirot closed the letter and placed it in his personal filing cabinet. He picked up his cup of tea, looked at his watch. 9:01. 1 minute late. What a scandal! And smiled to himself. The story was over, but its echo, like the pressure of a pen without ink, would remain engraved on the blank pages of those who still decided to read it. Chapter 13. The Page That Doesn't Turn. One November afternoon, Poirot walked through the aisles of a small second-hand bookshop in Chelsea. He enjoyed those places where the books weren't organized by genre, but by the random choices of long-time readers. It was, as he himself said, contained chaos, something he couldn't control, but he could study. As he leafed through a green, cloth-bound volume, his gaze fell on an untitled cover. Just a withered flower drawn in sepia ink. Clearly, it wasn't a trade edition. He opened it out of curiosity. The style seemed familiar. One name stood out in the dedication. For those who remained silent before their time, for those who spoke when no one was listening. Poirot read the first page. He recognized the structure, the words, the tone. It was the manuscript published, anonymous, but unmistakable. He smiled slowly. Then, without saying anything, he bought the copy, tucked it under his arm, and walked out onto the damp street, his cane tapping softly against the paving stones. The world wouldn't know of Villa Asterion. It wouldn't know of the Inkless notebook. It wouldn't know of Amand des Fleurs, or Ferraud, or Estelle, or Julien. But the story, somehow, had been saved from the bonfire. It had crossed the threshold. That evening, back in his apartment, Poirot sat down with a glass of liqueur and turned on his reading lamp. He opened the book to a random page and read, "Not all crimes have culprits. Some have consequences, and some consequences outlive the culprits." Put the book on the table. He opened his black notebook. He wrote one last entry, brief and precise. The end, but without a full stop. He closed the notebook, and with that, the echo of the case of the Inkless notebook disappeared into the perfect silence that Poirot so appreciated. Chapter 14. The Last Witness. 2 weeks after discovering the manuscript, in the Chelsea bookshop, Hercule Poirot received a visitor who, although unexpected, did not take him by surprise. At 4 o'clock sharp, just as the clock in his drawing-room struck the exact hour for tea, the maid announced the arrival of a visitor. Odette, the maiden of Villa Asterion. Odette repeated Poirot with interest, gently placing his cup back on its saucer. "Show her in at once." The young woman entered with the same humble expression I remembered, but with something different in her eyes, a mixture of determination and anxiety. She was dressed modestly, as always, but her steps were more determined. When she sat down opposite Poirot, she held a small worn paper envelope in her hands. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, "I've been thinking about the morning I found Monsieur Desfleur's body. I've thought about it many times, but there's something I didn't tell you." Poirot watched her without interrupting. He knew that silence was sometimes the most effective stimulus for confession. Odette swallowed. "The sheet of paper I found on the floor, the one I accidentally threw away, it wasn't blank, or not entirely. There was a line, just one, barely visible. I thought it was a wet stain. But now I'm sure it was handwriting." Poirot narrowed his eyes very slightly. "And why didn't you say it then?" "I was scared. I thought I'd messed up something important. Then you started discovering so many things, and I didn't know if saying it would change anything." "And what did that line say?" Odette opened the envelope. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper, old, recovered from a corner of the garden, she explained. She didn't know why she'd kept it, a feeling perhaps. An inner voice saying, "Don't throw this away." Poirot placed the paper under the lamp. He took out his magnifying glass. It was a faded sentence, written in watery ink, as if it had been washed away by a tear, or by the dampness of the ground. "In the end, I don't write to be read. I write so I don't forget." Poirot leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Odette. You have just closed a circle that seemed complete, but wasn't. Does that change anything? Maybe not in the crime, but in his soul, and in mine." The young woman lowered her gaze, relieved. "And what will you do with this?" Poirot folded the paper with great care, as if it were a relic. "I'll keep it, not as proof, but as a memory. Not all truths need judgment. Some just need to be remembered." Odette said goodbye with a small bow and left the room without looking back. Poirot, alone once more, took up his black notebook. He opened it to the last page and wrote, "Sometimes the most lasting ink is the one that isn't printed. It lives on in gestures, in silences, in invisible witnesses." He closed the notebook, and this time he sealed it with a red ribbon. One more case, one more crime, but a different lesson. Chapter 15. An Archived Truth. December brought a persistent fog to London, covering shop windows, fogging up cafe windows, and blurring the outlines of faces on the street. Poirot, however, maintained his routines with unwavering precision. Breakfast at 8, a short walk at 9, reading at 10. But that morning he interrupted the sacred order of his schedule with a single exception, a visit to the National Library. It wasn't out of curiosity, nor nostalgia, but rather a restlessness that had become a knot. The manuscript, now edited, published, read by a select few, had been born from a fragmented truth. But what was the official version maintained by the archives? What remained of Armand Desfleurs in the world's records? What memory had been allowed to survive? Upon arrival, Poirot requested the publishing house's files. House of Dawn, the company Armand had run for more than 2 decades. The files were on microfilm, preserved by a stern-faced assistant who recognized Poirot instantly, but had the courtesy to say nothing beyond "This way, monsieur." Poirot reviewed it thoroughly. Contracts, internal letters, financial reports, a precise and controlled network. Armand Desfleurs had been, until his last day, a publisher without visible blemishes. But among the internal letters, one caught his attention. It was an exchange between Desfleurs and a young Ferraud, from when the latter was just beginning his career. One line stood out. "There are manuscripts that are worth more for not being published. A true editor doesn't choose talent. He chooses strategic silence." Poirot froze. Had Ferraud learned to edit or to erase? Along with that letter, a list of rejected authors, accompanied by personal notes. One name was underlined: Chauvet, date 2009. Reason: mature style, but dangerously close to autobiographical. Recommendation: postpone. Postpone. Poirot repeated in a low voice. Or censor. In that instant, he realized that Armand Desfleurs had been editing not just stories, but lives. Those of others, and his own. He had withheld truths, not just out of fear, but out of a professional creed, to protect the most convenient narrative. As he left the library, Poirot felt neither anger nor disappointment, only understanding. Armand had been guilty, not of the crime, but of the initial silence. Ferraud of the next one. Julien of the echo. All of them cogs in a carefully oiled machine, smooth and steady, until someone, a voice, a nameless pen, decided to write down what hadn't been said. Upon returning home, Poirot received a small box with no return address. Inside, a notebook, not black, but white, untouched, and a note for someone who isn't afraid to start from scratch to fill it, unsigned. Poirot held it for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk. He took out the black notebook with the red ribbon and placed it beside him, one filled with truths between the lines, the other still empty. 2 notebooks, he murmured, one for remembering, the other for getting started. And with that decision, for the first time in weeks, he opened the new notebook and wrote, "This won't be an archive, it'll be a starting point." Because even for Poirot, the truth must not just be revealed. It must continue. Chapter 16. The Case That Is Not Forgotten. Days before Christmas, Poirot received an unexpected package. There was no return address, but the recipient's handwriting, Monsieur Hercule Poirot, London, was written with a dark blue ink pen, in slanted, careful, restrained letters. Upon opening it, he discovered a hand-bound copy. On the first page, in black ink, the Inkless notebook, a narrative based on facts that no one wanted to sign. Poirot slowly raised his left eyebrow. It wasn't the same anonymous volume he'd found in the Chelsea bookshop. This one seemed an even more private edition. There was something ceremonial about its workmanship. The thicker paper, the stiff covers, a red ribbon marking the middle of the text. Attached is a short letter, signed with initials that barely concealed its origin. "I have learned, Monsieur Poirot, that some books are not published for the world. They are published for oneself. This is my truth. Not the definitive one, but the one I have been able to tell. Thank you for teaching me not to destroy it. Ici, Estelle Chauvet. Poirot, moved, placed the book on his desk. For a moment, he didn't open it. Instead, he walked to his window and watched the city lights coming on in the evening. Beneath that apparent calm, so many stories, so many silences, so many half-spoken truths. That night, he turned on the lamp, sat down in his reading chair, and began to read. Page by page, word by word. It had changed. The narrative, the approach. It was written with less anger and more reflection. It was no longer an accusation. It was a testimony. And at the centre of it all, the figure of Armand de Fleur. Not as a villain or a martyr, but as a man trapped by his own rules. One sentence, in particular, stopped him in his tracks. He who edits the truth too much ends up not recognizing himself in what remains. Poirot closed his eyes. He felt the weight of that thought. Editing as control, silence as punishment, the manuscript as an attempt at redemption. The next day he visited the office of an old colleague, a publisher of biographies and historical essays. He handed him the copy. "This isn't a novel," said Poirot. "It's a case closed by law, but not by conscience. I don't want it published. I want it filed." The editor nodded, understanding without question. Because one day someone will search for the real story, and they'll need more than rumours. They'll need a voice. Poirot put down his book, shook the man's hand, and walked out without looking back. That same night, upon returning to his apartment, he wrote the last line in his white notebook. The truth doesn't always shine. Sometimes it remains between unprinted pages, waiting for the right reader. Then he closed the notebook, without sealing it this time. He left it open on his desk, next to a quill pen filled with ink. Chapter 17. The Place Where Words Begin. In the usual calm of the Whitehaven Mansions neighbourhood, a thin ray of sunlight filtered through the tulle curtains of Poirot's apartment. The Belgian detective was sorting through his morning correspondence, his silk shawl draped neatly over his shoulders, when his gaze fell on an unpostaled envelope. It had been delivered by hand. The note inside was brief, written in pencil on thick letter paper, a coffee in Montparnasse, the day after tomorrow, 9 Rue de l'Ambre, noon. Which, see, it wasn't a surprise. After everything that had happened, only one person would sign like this. Colette Durand. Poirot left for Paris that same night. Rue de l'Ambre was discreet, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the main boulevards. The café, decorated in amber, tones and Art Deco lamps, seemed suspended in another era. Colette was already expecting him. She was dressed in black, but not out of mourning. It was her style. In front of her, a steaming cup and an open notebook, this time with ink. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, barely smiling, "I didn't imagine you'd come." "Mademoiselle Durand, you know me. If a literary project remains unfinished, it's almost a crime for me." Colette laughed softly. Then she pointed at the notebook. "I'm writing something new. Nothing dramatic. A story about someone who finds a wordless notebook and decides to fill it with other lives. Does that seem trivial to you?" Poirot shook his head slightly. On the contrary, I find it restorative. Writing is about constructing meaning, and in your case also healing what others have destroyed. Even when one doesn't know if one has the right to say certain things, mademoiselle, Poirot replied in a gentle but firm tone. Justice is not found only in the courts. Sometimes it is found in honesty with oneself. Colette looked at him silently for a moment. I haven't seen Estelle again. Or Julien. Ferraud is somewhere in Geneva, I'm told, silent as always. And that weighs on you? No, it relieves me. The silence of others leaves me space to hear my voice. Poirot nodded. So, you've made peace with the Inkless notebook? Not exactly. I've only learned to write mine in my own ink. They remained silent for a few minutes, listening to the murmur of French conversations, the sound of teaspoons against porcelain. Finally, Colette asked, Do you think someone will ever write down this whole story as it happened? Poirot tilted his head. Maybe, but the most important question isn't whether it will be written, but whether it will be read with the right eyes. She closed her notebook and put it in her bag. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for not closing the case, but leaving it open where it should have been. Not all cases call for condemnation, mademoiselle. Some call for understanding, and those, the rarest ones, are the most instructive. Colette stood up. She greeted him with a nod that conveyed more respect than affection, more gratitude than nostalgia. Then she disappeared through the cafe's revolving door. Poirot stood for a moment longer, observing the street. Paris had seen him solve crimes, unmask impostors, expose deceptions. But this time he had merely been a witness, allowing others to find their own logic. He asked for the bill, left an exact tip, no more, no less, and went out for a walk along Boulevard Raspail, where the city breathed stories yet to be written. In his pocket, the white notebook was still waiting. Chapter 18. The Place Where the Ink Ends. It was January, in London. Winter had yet to reveal snow, but the streets were coated with a dampness that clung to the bone. Inside the apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, everything was in order. The clocks were perfectly synchronized, the flowers perfectly arranged, and the curtains measured to the millimetre. Hercule Poirot sat at his desk, his white notebook to his left, his fountain pen to his right. The time had come to write the last chapter. Not for others. For him, the Inkless notebook case hadn't ended with Armand Desfleur's death, nor with Ferraud's implicit confessions, nor with the anonymous publication of the manuscript, nor with the reparative acts of Estelle, Julien, and Colette. One last mystery remained unsolved, one that belonged not to the crime, but to the heart of the case. Why didn't Armand speak sooner? What stopped a man with such power over words? Poirot returned to the file he had guarded so carefully, the transcripts from the invisible notebook, the torn letters, the red diary. And finally he understood. It wasn't fear, it was faith. Armand believed that words carried weight, that they shouldn't be used lightly, that an accusation was also a judgment, and that not everyone who knew was ready to be a witness. That's why he waited. That's why he wrote without ink, to record without betraying, so that someone, not him, would decide if those words deserved to be spoken. And that decision, in the end, was shared. by Estelle, who accepted her story, by Colette, who shaped it, by Julien, who confronted his inaction, by Poirot, who simply observed the movement of the pieces without needing to push them. In the centre of his desk, Poirot opened the white notebook one last time, wrote, "The killer was fear, the weapon was silence, but the victim was the unspoken truth. The crime wasn't committed in one night. It was committed over years. Who is guilty then? All. Who redeemed him? The ink. Finally, the ink." Weeks later, Poirot received a simple package. Inside, a formal, modestly bound edition of the manuscript, now circulating among independent publishers under the title of words that were not said, signed finally with full name, Estelle Chauvet. On the inside flap, a dedication for H.P., who didn't need to solve everything to understand everything. Poirot placed the book in his personal library, right between great judicial speeches and Nietzsche's letters, where few people would look, but where he would know how to find it whenever he needed it. That night he took his cane, put on his coat, and walked slowly but steadily through the London fog. He passed a park without stopping. He crossed a bridge where the streetlights seemed to turn on just for him. No one recognized him. There was no need to. He had solved impossible murders, masterful robberies, unspeakable betrayals. But that case, the one of Inkless notebook, had been different, because it was not about discovering who he did it. It was about understanding why everyone was silent. And once he understood, this Poirot didn't need to point fingers. All it took was for someone, somewhere, to start writing. That night, before going to sleep, Poirot returned to his desk, stroked the cover of his white notebook, and with the same calmness with which he would close a perfectly timed pocket watch, he wrote 2 words. "It's over."